The mornings at the Abbey of Saint-Julien-sur-Loire began not with chatter or commotion, but with bells. Low and resonant, the sound rolled like mist down the valley, nudging the sleeping brothers awake before the sun touched the spires. Inside, its limestone walls warmed by centuries of quiet prayer, the abbey breathed in rhythm with the hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, until the last bell marked conclave. And within that rhythm, Brother Etienne found something strange and soft blooming beneath the quiet, a longing of the sort that had no place in the rule of Saint Benedict. Brother Etienne had arrived at Saint Julien during the cool breath of early spring in 1296. The prior at his former post, a smaller priory on the coast of Normandy, had spoken well of his talents. Obedient, precise, good with delicate hands. He was neither tall nor memorable in form, and his quiet voice often dissolved into the sounds of cloistered life. Yet his fingers were graceful, steady enough for script, and his eyes held the kind of patient melancholy that seemed appropriate for a man of God. He was assigned to the scriptorium and the cloister garden. His duties alternated between ink and earth copying psalms by candlelight in the mornings, and pruning lavender and rosemary in the still afternoons. The others called it dull labor, but Etienne never minded. The rows of herbs were like scripture. To him, orderly, fragrant, forgiving. The lavender especially. Its grey-green stems gave off a scent even when cut, and bees lingered over the flowers as if in contemplation. The garden sat in the heart of the abbey, wrapped by high stone corridors, on four sides, open to the sky above, and in its eastern corner stood a trellis of climbing rosesoft, pale pink, like the inside of a seashell. It was there that Etienne first heard the humming dot. At first, he thought it was wind, a soft, lilting sound, rising and falling like a wordless hymn. But when he paused his shears and moved closer, he saw her. A woman, young, with earth on her apron and a basket of withering thyme in her arms. She stood just outside the boundary wall, in the adjacent orchard belonging to the convent of St. Clair. The two religious houses shared a stone wall, but little else. Yet here she was, on the other side of the trellis, humming as she pulled. Late spring herbs from the earth. Etienne didn't speak. He returned to trimming. But the sound of her voice lingered longer than the fragrance of rosemary on his sleeves. The nun was not a nun, not yet. A novice, he would later learn. Her name was Cecile. She had come from a merchant family in Tours, sent to the convent after her older brothers secured apprenticeships and her father lost a shipping deal to a foreign fleet. She did not resent the decision, only the silence that came with it. Her humming, she later confessed, was a way to remind herself that she was still alive. They did not speak for many days, only tended, she in the orchard with its pear trees and dried mint, and he in the garden with its measured rows of lavender and sage. But the trellis became something of a conduit. Through its lattice of rose, stems and thorns, they would pass. Glances, and once or twice, seedlings. One morning, she dropped a folded slip of parchment through the vines pressed between two sprigs of marjoram. Etienne hesitated before unfolding it. It read, "Do you believe God made the scent of lavender to remind us of things we forgot to feel?" There was no name, no return address, but the letters were round, precise, and edged in ink she must have borrowed from her abbess's storeroom. Etienne spent the night staring at it in his narrow cell. The next day, he left a note folded inside a sprig of sage, nestled at the base of the trellis. Perhaps it is not what we forgot, Perhaps it is what we were never allowed to feel. What began as seasonal tending turned into ritual. Spring passed into early summer, and the gardens flushed with colour. Calendula, verbena, and rue grew tall. Tomatoes glistened in the convent orchard. Cecil and Etienne saw each other daily, ever speaking, only watching, exchanging herbs, folded scraps, tiny pieces of poetry and philosophy that could be denied if discovered. They wrote of smells, of wind and stone, of how the moonlight made the courtyard seem like a chapel without a roof. They never once mentioned affection, nor did they address one another by name. Still, something was shifting beneath the stillness. Etienne noticed it in how his hands trembled slightly when folding a reply. Cecil noticed it in how she began memorizing his footprints in the dirt between garden beds. The trellis became a confessional, a diary, a small defiance wrapped in vines, and yet no secret stays hidden beneath sunlight forever. In the 9th week of their correspondence, an elder sister from the convent noticed a folded paper stuck among the rose stems. She didn't touch it, but she watched. When she returned later that day and found it gone, she made quiet inquiries. The nuns grew cautious. So did Etienne. One evening, during Vespers, the abbot called Etienne aside. He asked whether anything in the garden had distracted him from his duties. Etienne, eyes low, replied that the herbs had been flourishing. The abbot did not press further, but his tone held weight. That night, Etienne did not sleep. At dawn, he went to the trellis. Nothing, no paper, no voice, no humming. The garden felt different in the silence, as if it were listening, not offering comfort, but warning. For 6 days, the trellis remained still. Then, on the 7th, as Etienne clipped faded blossoms from the lavender, he saw a bundle nestled in the leaves. It was not paper but a small sachet, stitched from linen and tied with a faded blue thread. Inside was dried rosemary, marjoram, and something else, a single lock of dark hair. There was no note, no reply. Etienne didn't know what to do with it. He could not return the gesture. To accept it felt like a vow he had no words for. He buried the sachet beneath the oldest lavender bush in the garden. He pressed the soil down gently with his palms and said nothing to the others when they passed. Years later, long after Cecil took her final vows and Etienne was reassigned to another abbey, the garden remained. The trellis still bloomed with roses, though no one tended it quite the same way. The lavender still grew, and the oldest bush in its far eastern corner seemed to flower longer than the rest. Sometimes, visiting monks would remark on the fragrance of that patch, saying it reminded them of music they couldn't name. And some nights, when the moon was soft enough and the wind still, it was said that a faint humming could be heard from the other side of the garden wall. But no one knew whose voice it was. Not anymore. The manor at Argentel was not famous, nor particularly grand. Nestled at the edge of a gently sloping valley in southwestern France, it belonged to a family of modest nobility, whose influence waned with each passing generation. By the year 1324, the estate had only a few claims to distinction. An aging watchtower no longer used for watching, a modest chapel built of river stones, and a remarkably well-tended orchard known for its sweet pink apples. The orchard, surrounded by tall hedges of climbing roses, was the domain of Lady Eleanor. At 19, she was unmarried not for lack of suitors, but because her father, Lord Eymeri, had grown cautious in his old age. He rejected most matches on account of land disputes, family feuds, or insufficient titles. Eleanor, raised more by the garden than by governesses, never minded. The orchard gave her everything she needed: air, privacy, purpose. Every morning before the sun climbed high enough to bake the stone paths, Eleanor walked the rows. The apple trees were old, some as much as 100 years, and their gnarled limbs needed careful coaxing. She spoke to them as she pruned, not in words of affection, but in the quiet logic of someone who had always found more comfort in tending branches than navigating conversations in the great hall. The rose hedges that surrounded the orchard were nearly 7 feet tall, deliberately overgrown. Her grandfather had planted them in a spiral pattern decades ago, claiming it would confuse the deer. Eleanor kept the shape because it confused people instead. She could disappear in those hedges for hours, pruning thorns and collecting petals for rosewater. No one bothered her there. No one, that is, until the arrival of the scribe. His name was Luke. He had been hired to copy the family's old charters and land deeds, aging parchments from generations past that were turning to dust in the manor's cellar. He wasn't quite a servant, but neither was he gentry. He occupied the odd middle ground afforded to literate men without noble birth, respected for his usefulness, but rarely invited to speak beyond what was necessary. Luke was pale, with soot, hair and ink-stained fingers. He moved quietly, which made his footsteps all the more startling when Eleanor first encountered him in the orchard. He had taken a wrong turn after leaving the chapel, following the scent of roses instead of the gravel path. "You're not supposed to be here," she had said flatly, stepping from the hedgerow with pruning shears in hand. Luke had bowed deeply for a man with his posture, and stammered something about the smell of apples. "You smell like ink," she replied, then disappeared back into the roses. It was not love at first meeting. It was not even affection. What brought them together was boredom and a shared appreciation for silence. A few days later, Luke returned, not intentionally, he claimed, but with a half sheet of parchment tucked into the sleeve of his robe. Eleanor found it later, wedged into a low fork in one of the apple trees. On it, written in precise script, was a single question: do apples feel lonely without bees? It was absurd, and yet charming in a way that surprised her. Eleanor did not reply immediately. She left the page in the tree and ignored it for a day. But on the second morning, she returned with a dried blossom tied to a new parchment. Not if they grow together in a garden. That became the beginning of a strange ritual. Letters left in the trees, beneath stones, behind the hedges. The orchard, already private, became a second language. Eleanor would spend her mornings walking and tending as usual, but now with eyes scanning for ink hidden in bark or under petals. Lutz's notes were odd. He asked questions no one else would ask. Why do ants prefer pear trees over plum, or whether birds remembered the smell of last year's fruit? His curiosity was not performative, it was genuine. And Eleanor, despite herself, began to look forward to the quiet laughter that bloomed when she read his latest thought. They never signed their notes. They never referred to each other directly. But gradually, the messages turned from questions into observations, and then into confessions of love, exactly, but of solitude. Eleanor wrote about how it felt to grow up without a mother. Luke admitted he had been raised in a monastery where kindness was considered distraction. They were small truths whispered through parchment. One morning, a storm rolled in from the western hills. The orchard, usually quiet in summer, crackled with tension. Eleanor walked its edges, inspecting the younger trees for damage. when she noticed the parchment hanging from a rose branch. This time, it was different. The note read, "Meet me tomorrow at sunrise, near the white apple tree. Only if you wish to hear my voice." There were no metaphors, no questions, just a request. That night, Eleanor barely slept. Her room, high in the manor's east wing, looked down on the orchard, though the hedges blocked all but a sliver of it from view. She paced for hours. Her breath felt thick with thought. Was this foolish? Dangerous? She had heard stories of girls disgraced for less, but she also knew herself and knew that if she didn't go, she would never again walk the orchard without wondering what might have happened if she had done so. At first light, she crept barefoot down the service stairs, carrying her cloak and a pair of rough slippers. The garden was wet with dew, the roses still closed from the storm's passing. She reached the white apple tree, the one with bark as pale as parchment, and there he was. Luke, he stood like someone unsure if they were real. When he saw her, his breath caught. "You came," he said. She only nodded. They did not embrace. They did not touch. They only stood in the quiet, beneath the spreading limbs of the tree. As a breeze rustled through the orchard and bees returned to their labor, over the next weeks, they met 4 more times always, at dawn, always by the same tree. They spoke of nothing grand. They discussed tree grafting, rainfall, Latin grammar, but each meeting carried a quiet electricity, as if time bent around them to allow the moment to last longer. But secrets, like sap, always rise. It was a chambermaid who noticed. One morning, changing Eleanor's linens, she saw the corner of a letter tucked under her pillow. She said nothing, but later whispered to a stable boy, who whispered to a cook, who whispered to Lord Imrie the next morning. The orchard gate was locked. Eleanor was forbidden from tending the trees. Luke was dismissed without a public accusation, only the excuse that his work had concluded. He left that same evening, walking down the winding road with a satchel and the last letter Eleanor had written to him. He never read it in full, not yet, only the first line. "I do not know if apples feel lonely without bees, but I know I do without you." Years passed. Eleanor eventually married a northern baron whose name appears briefly in the records of a minor tax revolt. She managed his lands and bore 2 children. She lived long and without scandal, but every spring, when the roses bloomed and the apples began to form, she walked her own gardens at dawn, and sometimes, when she reached the far edge where a single white-barked apple tree had been planted on her wedding day, she left a folded slip of parchment wedged in the bark. She never signed them, but in each one, she always included a question, just in case. In the town of Bruges, where the cobbled streets glistened with canal mist and the market squares smelled faintly of wool and barley, there was once a weaving house with blue shutters and a crooked chimney. It was not the largest nor the most esteemed, but it produced reliable cloth, durable in winter and respectful in color. The house belonged to Master Willem de Groot, a weaver of fine reputation and questionable eyesight, whose daughter Lisbeth was said to be better with thread than half the journeymen in Flanders. Lisbeth was 23 and unmarried, which in the eyes of the guildwives made her both respectable and suspicious. She had a quiet, clever face and a habit of tilting her head when listening, as though she were hearing music in the silence. She could thread a loom in near darkness and was often left in charge of the shop when her father travelled to Lille or Ghent to negotiate wool prices. She loved the feel of the threads sliding through her fingers' linen, flax, and, on rare occasions, silk. But her true joy lay in patterns. not the bold, heraldic tapestries of knights in coats of arms, but the smaller, humbler designs woven for convents and household chapels, vines, animals, herbs, blossoms. To Lisbeth, every pattern was a language. A vine was not just a vine. It was a question, an invitation, a line of poetry too quiet for speech. It was through this language that she first met Adelyne. Adelyne was a scribe, not one employed by the church, but by the town records office. His duties were bland and highly necessary, documenting grain taxes, property deeds, wool tariffs. His workspace was a stone chamber above the dye shop, and he often came to the weaving house to collect parchment scraps for sealing or binding. He wore dull colors and had a tendency to tap his fingers on the inside of his sleeve when bored, which was often the first time he saw Lisbeth. She was seated on a low stool, adjusting the foot pedals of her loom. She did not look up. The second time, she handed him a bundled pile of fabric samples and nodded once. No words. The third time, he lingered. "This is linen," he asked, holding up a pale scrap threaded with faint lilac-colored ivy. "Flax linen," she replied. "But the ivy is not for sale." "Why not?" "Because it says something," she said, and then turned back to her loom. Adelyne stood for a moment, unsure whether he had been dismissed or invited. In the weeks that followed, Lisbeth began to leave tiny tapestries 3 inches wide, no more than finger-length, folded near the edge of the work table. Each had a different motif: a vine curling round a sparrow, a fox beneath a branch of myrtle, a woven pomegranate split in half. Adelyne took them. He studied them like puzzles, then began to reply knot and thread, but on paper he left small slips, hidden between cloth bolts, written in elegant hand. "If the fox waits beneath the myrtle, is it longing or hiding?" Lisbeth's next tapestry showed the same fox, eyes closed, sleeping under petals, and so it continued. Their conversation unfolded in silence and symbols. For every letter he wrote, she returned a tapestry. The pomegranate was answered with a dove. A stitched ladder between tulips came back with a note. I would climb it, even if it led only to silence. They spoke to no one of this. No townsfolk suspected, no apprentices noticed. But Lisbeth's tapestries began to take on a new warmth, shades of plum and gold, textures of rose stems and wheat braid. Her father believed it was artistic growth. The guild wives assumed she was preparing a bridal dowry, though no suitor had been officially named. Only the loom knew what was being said. One evening, Adelyne left a final message tucked inside a folded parchment ribbon. "Would you ever speak, if I were allowed to ask?" Lisbeth stared at it for a long time. She placed the note inside a small basket, weighed it with a spool of wool, and carried it home. That night, she did not sleep. There was a problem. Adelyne was promised, not to a bride, but to a position. He had been offered an appointment in Arras, transcribing court records and managing legal inventories for a magistrate. It was a prestigious post, and he had not refused it. Lisbeth wove for hours the next morning, fingers tight with thought. When Adelyne arrived later that day, no tapestry awaited him. Only a long linen band hung in the corner window. It showed a doorway surrounded by vines, left half open. Beneath it was a single cymbalan, open lily dot. She did not speak when he came. He only bowed, touched the edge of the tapestry with his fingertips, and left. Adelyne departed Bruges 2 days later. Lisbeth did not cry. She continued to weave, quietly, even elegantly. She created altar cloths and herb-printed prayer mats for years. Her reputation grew. She never married, and she never stopped weaving small tapestries with coded motifs, though she no longer left them out. Some said they were personal studies. Others believed they were devotional pieces. But those who saw the one with the fox under the myrtle, the open lily, or the broken pomegranate, found themselves oddly quiet afterward, as though something had been said in a language they almost remembered. And high above the dye shop, in a box tucked inside the wall, were 5 miniature tapestries, preserved in wax paper. Adelyne had kept them. He never framed them, never showed them, but each time he looked at the one with the ladder in tulips, he remembered how silence, too, could bloom into something worth answering. In the south of France, in the little hill town of Courtship, there once existed a garden with no path, no benches, and no gate. It was not marked on any town map, and its tall stone walls bore no inscription. Most people in the town had never seen the inside, though nearly all had passed by its plain wooden door near the monastery infirmary. The locals called it Le Jardin des Silences, the Garden of Silences, and assumed it belonged to the apothecary. The apothecary, Madame Eleonore, was a widow in her 50s, known for her clear tinctures and her refusal to gossip. She sold honey syrup in blue glass bottles, and her wormwood balm was said to ease both swelling and sorrow. Her hair was always covered with a clean muslin scarf, and her hands were stained faintly green with crushed rue and feverfew. She lived alone, save for her apprentice, a young woman named Thérèse, who had come from Albi to study medicinal plants. Thérèse was quiet and precise, and she rarely looked anyone in the eye. She was said to have once studied with a nun healer near Toulouse, but no one knew why she had left so suddenly. Madame Eleonore never asked. The two women worked in tandem, grinding, boiling, drying herbs by weight and season, but neither ever mentioned the garden behind the stone wall. It was not until the 4th year of Thérèse's apprenticeship that she was given the key. Madame Eleonore handed it to her without ceremony one dry September morning. It was iron, unpolished, and heavier than it looked. "There are things you can only grow where no one walks," she said. Thérèse said nothing, but she understood. That evening, after the shop had closed and the town's bells had rung vespers, she slipped out the back door and unlocked the garden. What she found was not what she had expected. There were no rows, no borders. The plants grew as they pleased. Thyme tangled with sage, marjoram wrapped around iris stalks, foxglove and nightshade bloomed beside gentian and valerian. There were no signs or labels, and yet it was not wild. There was an order in the disorder, a deliberate silence in the way the plants leaned, as if obeying a rhythm not visible to the eye. In the center was a dry stone fountain, covered with lichen. A bowl of smooth river stones sat beside it, each one etched with a single herbal symbol. Thérèse sat on the edge and did not speak. She returned the next night, and the next it was, in this hidden garden, that she first met Martin. He arrived late, after the bell for Compline, carrying a broken sandal and a cut on his thumb. He was not a monk, though he dressed like one. He was a traveling copyist, working for a local scriptorium during harvest season, recording grain tallies and translating obscure sermons. Madame Eleonore treated his cut with comfrey and told him to keep it dry. It was Thérèse who offered him a tisane. He drank it in silence, then said, "You don't speak much." She replied, "Neither do you." From then on, he came every third day, sometimes for bomb, sometimes for no reason at all. He never asked about the garden. He never tried to enter it. But one evening, she found a small paper folded inside the herb basket, a sketch of the garden gate drawn from memory with the words, "Even what's closed still carries fragrance." She kept the note in the pouch with her mortar and pestle. Over the next few months, they fell into a pattern exchanging books, notes, sometimes no more than glances. He never touched her hand, but once she handed him a jar of golden balm and their fingers brushed. That night, she planted a sprig of violet near the wall. Madame Eleanor said nothing, but the next day, she left a second iron key hanging on the hook by the back door. Martin never took it. He never entered the garden, not once. Perhaps he understood the garden was not for walking. Perhaps he believed love, like certain herbs, bloomed best in the dark. Then came the outbreak, a fever, swift and sudden, swept through cords. That winter, the infirmary overflowed. Madame Eleanor barely slept. Theres brewed night decoctions in batches, ground white willow by the pound. But it was not enough. Martin did not fall ill, but he volunteered to help copy the names of the dead into the civic register. It took him 3 days. On the 4th day, he brought a letter. He had been offered work in Marseille, preparing botanical manuscripts for a physician with royal connections. It was dangerous to stay. The fever still circled. And yet, he did not smile as he spoke of it. "I could stay," he said, softly. Ars did not answer. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a parchment envelope. Inside was a single violet, pressed flat, bound with linen thread. Martin took it. He left that night. He never returned. No one knew what had happened, whether he reached Marseille or fell ill along the road. His name never appeared again in the records, but years later, a copy of the Liber de Herbis, printed in Lyon, included a full illustration of the Cord's gardening, marked, unnamed, drawn from memory in delicate ink. At the bottom of the page, a tiny violet, pressed into the margin. Theres stayed in cords. She inherited the apothecary shop when Madame Eleanor passed. She never married. She tended the garden in silence, as always. Some said it was a garden for healing. Others said it was for grief. But those who stood near the stone wall on quiet mornings sometimes reported the faint smell of violet, even in winter. And a few said that if you looked closely through the crack near the hinge, you could just make out a sprig of foxglove curling toward the light. No one ever found the second iron key, and no one ever walked in the garden again. In the quiet hills of 13th century Provence, there was a garden that did not boast of grandeur, yet it breathed an ancient rhythm known only to the bees and the women who tended herbs before matins. The Lady Adelyne of Solignac, widowed since her 32nd year, walked these garden paths daily with the kind of patience one does not learn but slowly absorbs, like the scent of crushed thyme beneath, the heel or the way lavender air settles into linen over years. The manor stood stone still, above a cliff that watched over the violet rows of the abbey's lavender fields below. They bloomed late in the summer sun, humming with life and yet strangely still, like a tapestry left out in the sun, its colors fixed in place by time and weather. Adelyne rarely left the manor walls now. Her 2 sons had gone to study in Toulouse. Her steward managed the estate. And yet, each day, Adelyne rose just after the first bell of the abbey echoed through the hills, and descended to the medicinal garden to meet with the one man permitted to enter that walled quiet, the apothecary. His name was Guillaume. The villagers did not know much about him except that he was educated, that he wore his robes well past their prime, and that he came not from Solignac, but from farther south, perhaps Narban, or even Spain. Gillam had no land of his own, but rented a corner of the monastery's outer grounds to distill herbs and prepare tonics. He spoke seldom, but he listened in full sentences. That, perhaps, is what drew Adelyne first. Their arrangement was simple. She kept the garden, verbena, pennyroyal, rosemary, and yarrow. He advised what to sow, what to dry, what to brew, and in what order to boil away bitterness. They spoke little at first. Gillam would kneel by the lavender hedges with a blade no longer than a finger, inspecting leaves with the reverence of a monk. Adelyne, gloved and sun-hatted, would prune behind him, listening to the soft snip of work rather than words. Over time, their silences gained texture. He would say, "The yarrow favors the shaded wall after frost." She would reply, "Then it shall keep company with the rue this season," and nothing more. But that nothingness was not empty. It was comfortable, like old parchment worn, soft at the edges. Gillam never crossed the stone threshold of the manor. He was paid not in coin, but in parchment, sometimes in beeswax candles or wintered wine. Yet Adelyne began saving the best. Cuttings for his mortar, the richer marjoram, the most fragrant mint. She pressed dried sage in little satchels and left them on the garden bench near the gate. One winter, Gillam brought her a codexa, fragile collection of Greek herbals, translated into crude Latin by hand. "It is not approved by the bishop," he said quietly, "but it tells of the body as the garden and the spirit as the wind through it." Adelyne kept it in a linen wrapper beneath her bed. She read it in the afternoons while the wind whispered between the shutters. What bloomed between them was never named. There were no declarations, no letters, no promises. But when Gillam handed her a sprig of hyssop, he did not just speak of its medicinal property. He held her gaze for one moment, too long, as if naming something wordlessly. That summer, the lavender bloomed late and heavy. The bees came in slow clouds, drunk on the season. Gillam arrived each day with his weathered satchel and spoke more than before about his mother's orchard, about the way some smells never leave a childhood memory. Adelyne began to share too, her first husband's laughter before the fever. Took him the way her sons used to press daisies into her prayer book. There were no secrets, only stories, and yet they moved like confessionals between them. One afternoon, under the low sun, Gillam paused at the rosemary beds and said softly, "This garden forgets nothing." Adelyne didn't answer at first. She stood beside him, watching his hand gently dust the soil from a root crown. "It remembers," she replied, "but it does not punish." He looked up, and in that glance something shifted. The air, long held between them like folded linen, unfolded slightly. Still, nothing was done. No lines crossed. He remained behind the hedge at dusk, always leaving before vespers. She never asked why he came so regularly, even in rain. Nor did he ask why she had never remarried. The forbiddenness was not scandalous, was structural. He was beneath her station. She was vowed to widowhood. He lived under monastic authority. She carried her family's name. To even touch his hand in public would require the invention of a reason the world would not accept. And so, their affection took quieter forms. Gillam began leaving things behind. A jar of honeyed lozenges for her cough. A new herb knife with her initials carved into the handle. She, in return, pressed lavender blossoms into parchment and left them inside his herbal cods. In time, he began teaching her tincture measurements. She learned to dry petals between vellum, to distill salves without burning the oil. It was a strange intimacy to share the making of things that healed others, even as their own longing remained unhealed and unnamed. Years passed this way. The garden grew taller, denser. The rosemary turned woody, the laurel hedge thickened. New hands came to prune and water, but still Gillam came. And still Adelyne walked with him under the excuse of tending to health. One spring, after a bitter winter, Gillam did not come for many weeks. Adelyne asked the abbey steward. He shrugged. Sick, perhaps, or tending to someone dying. She waited. At last, Gillam returned, thinner, with eyes sunken but alert. He said only, "I had fever." She said only, "I have valerian for sleep," and nothing more but that. Day, she touched his arm as she handed him the satchel. Not a lingering touch, just enough, just once. That night, she did not sleep. The bees were quiet now. The garden hummed only with wind and breath. She lit a candle and opened the herbal he'd given her years ago. Between the pages of hyssop and thyme, a single pressed petal fell. Violet, she smiled, unsure whether she had placed it there or he had, long ago. The garden remembers. She thought Dot, and so she waited again. Gillam came the next day, and the next. But now he spoke with less reserve. "If I were not who I am," he said once, while tending valerian roots, "I would ask to stay past dusk." "If I were not who I am," she replied, "I might say yes." That was all. That was everything. They grew old. Adelyne's hair silvered like the frost-laced sage. Gillam's hands grew stiff in the cold, but he still carried scissors wrapped in cloth and still corrected her drying racks with quiet precision. When he stopped coming, it was not sudden. He merely missed a few days, then a week. Then came word. He had died in his sleep. "Peacefully," said the monk who came with the message. No pain. His hands folded with a sprig of rosemary and a petal of violet wrapped in waxed linen. Adelyne did not cry. She went to the garden. She pulled her gloves on. She pruned the lavender for the first time that season. And when the sun fell, she opened the codex again and tucked a new petal between the last page and the binding this time, a white rose, and so ended the lavender courtship, one never spoken aloud, yet fully lived in the hush of leaves, the scrape of garden shears, and the quiet rhythms of a love that asked for nothing except time, and left behind everything except regret. High in the wet green hills of the Lotharingian borderlands, where fog slipped through branches like wool drawn through needles, there stood a quiet abbey almost no one visited. It was not grand. It had no relics. No saints had died there. It was known only for its silence and its gardens. St. Bellara's Abbey had once been a convent, long ago, before the Black Death came and swallowed its inhabitants whole. It was later re-inhabited, not by monks or nuns, but by lay brothers and a handful of oblates, people who gardened and kept bees and sang no loud prayers. They lived quietly, asked no alms, and sent no letters. They were not forgotten. They were simply uninterested in being remembered. Among the mossed cloisters and sagging dormitories, the central feature was a vast walled garden, not the tidy kind with clipped boxwood and flagged paths, but a wild, spiraling, almost chaotic tangle of herbs, fruit trees, medicinal beds, moss-covered stones, and shaded walkways where roses climbed over broken trellises. It had once been organized according to the rule of Saint Benedict, then neglected, then reimagined by generations of hands who left behind no names. It was here that the whispering gardeners, as locals quietly called them, passed their days. They tended not only the flowers, but the gossip of the region. Traveling merchants occasionally stopped to trade preserved pears and pressed lavender oil for wax and honey. With them came letters from bishops and barons and board scribes, and though the abbey remained silent, its garden bloomed with knowledge and quiet, fragrant rebellion. The abbey's senior gardener in the year 1421 was a man named Brother Ulbricht, a widower before he joined the lay order. He was known for his silent pruning and the way he sang to the vines under his breath, in a dialect no longer spoken. Beneath his care, the garden had become even more unruly, but in a way that made it feel more alive. Peas mingled with poppies. Wormwood leaned against ripening apricots. Bees were everywhere, and no one minded. That year, in the height of spring, a new novitiate arrived, sent not from any clerical authority, but from a noble household in Mainz. The boy, whose name was Wulfric, was no more than 16. Pale, uncertain, and silent, he carried only a rolled vellum scroll with the seal of a powerful abbess and a book of herbal remedies. In Latin he clearly could not read. He was placed in the garden. This was not uncommon. The abbey did not refuse those who needed to disappear. Many of its members had arrived in much the same way, but it became clear within weeks that Wulfric had not come only to pray or vanish. He watched the bees, he wept during rain, and he seemed to recognize plants he had never been taught. Most curiously, he kept a distance from Brother Albrecht till midsummer. It was then that Albrecht found the boy one dusk curled beneath the branches of the old quince tree, reading aloud to himself, not from the Latin herbarium, but from a love poem written in a language the boy had no business knowing, and yet he recited it softly, as if it were a lullaby he had been raised with. When Albrecht questioned him, Wulfric at first refused to speak, but days later, with fingers stained from crushed anemones, he admitted the truth. He had been sent away not for piety, nor illness, but for the crime of loving a young knight named Emmerich, whose family had arranged a duel to decide the boy's fate. Emmerich had vanished. Wulfric had been smuggled north. Brother Albrecht, who had loved and lost in his own time, said nothing, but he made space for Wulfric in the herb beds and taught him the secret patterns of watering and pruning that allowed love to survive under the guise of foliage. They began to plant with intention, valerian near violets, foxglove beside forget-me-nots, small coded messages of hope and longing hidden in plain sight. Soon the garden became something more than practical. It was a coded language, a place of memory and mourning, and a sanctuary for exiles. Letters came less frequently that year, and when they did, Wulfric did not read them. He became quieter, stronger, and Brother Albrecht grew old without noticing. Then, one day in late autumn, a rider arrived. He wore the colors of a minor house. Dust covered his cloak. He asked nothing of the monks. He merely entered the garden and walked, slowly, as if following a trail only he could see. Wulfric found him by the pear arbor. They spoke no words, none were needed. It was Emmerich, older, injured, changed, but alive. He had crossed through war-torn regions and bandit-tridden forests with only rumors to guide him. And yet the garden had called him back. They walked the paths until dusk, and then, quietly, both disappeared into the upper cloisters. No records were kept. No vows were made. Only years later, when Brother Albrecht passed away beneath the jasmine arbor, did someone find the last addition to the garden plan. It was not a map, but a legend, a quiet key to the plants and what they symbolized. And among the final entries were two names, not of saints or abbots, just Emmerich and Wulfric, beside the drawing of a quince blossom. In time, the abbey faded further from memory. Its stone cracked, its windows went blind with ivy, but the garden endured. Even now, when rain falls over those hills and no one walks the old gravel paths, the herbs still grow in strange, improbable combinations. And if you kneel quietly, you may hear more than bays you may hear, the language of love grown in silence. And remember that in even the most forgotten corners of history, something tender was blooming. The gardens of Dunroth Abbey were not built for beauty. They were built for service, for the cultivation of medicinal herbs, bitter roots, and humble vegetables to feed a community of Benedictine monks in the damp northern reaches of medieval Scotland. But time, as it always does, softened the edges. Moss climbed where bricks had cracked. Wild roses, once pulled out as weeds, returned in clusters near the eastern fence, and in one small corner, just behind the gate used only by the abbey's gardener, something altogether unexpected began to bloom. It was the year 1291. Scotland stood on the cusp of disarray. The death of King Alexander III had left a void, and rumours of war, inheritance, and English involvement buzzed across even the most isolated cloisters. But within Dunroth's walls, life continued in measured rhythms. The tolling of bells, the scraping of spoons on wooden bowls, the silent tending of garden beds. Brother Caelan was not a remarkable monk. He had come to Dunroth in his early 20s after a life of hard field labour and silence to things that translated easily into monastic routine. He was given the task of maintaining the garden due to his strong back, and he took to the work with quiet devotion. Days passed slowly in the garden. Each plant had its season, each season its pattern, and Caelan knew the soil by scent as much as by sight. The gate he used to exit the garden each evening was old, its hinges groaning slightly in protest. It opened to a narrow path that curved down toward the village. Officially, no monk was to leave the abbey unaccompanied, but Caelan had been granted silent permission and understanding that he might venture down to trade extra herbs with the village healer when necessary. His exchanges were brief, efficient, emotionless, until one late afternoon in midsummer, when the sun had cast a golden line across the garden wall and the wind carried the scent of crushed lavender. The gate creaked open and someone else was standing there. She wore a linen shawl pulled tightly across her shoulders, and a woven basket rested in the crook of her arm. Her name was Elspeth. She was the new healer's assistant, or so she said. Her voice was careful, like someone stepping over ice. Caelan looked at her for only a moment, then stepped aside, assuming she had taken a wrong turn. But she stood still. "I heard your marigold has taken to the shade," she said. "That's rare." Caelan didn't answer. Not because he meant to be rude, but because no one outside the abbey had spoken to him in months, especially not about flowers. She glanced at the plant beds, then back at him. "If you move the valerian, it might get better light." He nodded. She left. That first meeting might have passed as forgettable, but it didn't. She returned 2 days later, then again a week after that, always under the guise of delivering supplies or checking on herbal needs. Her comments were always small, practical. "The sage is flowering early," or "You've got snails in the cabbages." But there was a rhythm to it, a familiarity growing, not with intention, but with inevitability. Caelan began leaving the gate open slightly. Elspeth began bringing scraps of parchment-told herbal notes, copied by hand from her master's books. She'd lay them on a stone near the gate without a word. He began leaving dried sprigs of rosemary or bundles of mint in return. The conversation remained mostly in gestures, to people exchanging pieces of the world in silence. It would be wrong to say they fell in love. That would require declarations, recognition, perhaps even regret. What they shared was quieter than that. It was presence. It was the steady beat of two lives crossing without touching. One foggy morning, when the summer had shifted to the early signs of autumn, Elspeth did not come. Nor the next day, nor the day after that. The gate stayed closed. Weeks passed. The monks spoke of Rumour's End English patrol spotted near the coast. A healer in the village accused of harbouring someone suspected of seditious speech. Caolan didn't ask questions. Monks weren't supposed to. Then, on a morning colder than it should have been, he found a strip of linen tied to the inner gate handle. It was weathered from rain. A single pressed petal of yarrow clung to it. He didn't untie it. The garden continued to grow. Seasons shifted. Caolan aged. He passed the role of gardener to a younger monk and took on lighter duties copying texts, mixing tinctures. But even in old age, when his hands trembled and his knees refused to kneel, he would sometimes walk the edge of the garden wall and glance toward the gate. It was never opened again for anything but compost. No one knew his thoughts. Monks did not speak of what once was, and certainly not of what might have been. Yet, in the records of Dunroth's Abbey library, tucked within the margins of an herbarium, copied by Brother Cologne, is a small note in faded ink beside the entry for yarrow. Shade does not always mean the absence of light. Sometimes it hides the things we are not permitted to name. The page bears a smudge, possibly from a pressed petal long since lost. And so the garden grew, and grew still. But within its gates was once planted a story that could not be spoken, only grown, exchanged, and quietly remembered. There was nothing particularly grand about the mulberry tree that grew in the northwest courtyard of St. Aldwyn's Manor. It leaned ever so slightly to the left, as though ashamed of having grown too tall. Its branches twisted in curious angles, and its leaves grew in mismatched clusters that seemed more stubborn than lush. It bore fruit inconsistently, some summers generously, others barely at all. But beneath it sat an old wooden bench, and on that bench, for nearly 3 decades, a woman named Agnetha waited every Sunday afternoon. The records of St. Aldwyn's are filled with accounts of renovations and property disputes, but they make no mention of the bench, nor of Agnetha. Yet her presence was known to generations of household staff and distant visitors. She was not a servant, nor a relative, nor, by most accounts, someone of notable birth or fortune. But each week, dressed in faded garments of deep blue and forest green, she arrived with a satchel of embroidery and a quiet demeanor, and took her place beneath the tree without fail. She never entered the manor. She never asked for tea. The gardeners left her undisturbed. The younger maids gossiped about her in the kitchens, speculating whether she was a widow, a witch, or the ghost of someone not yet dead. But Agnetha remained politely unbothered by such talk. She brought her thread, her needle, and her silence. The story, whispered from one chambermaid to another, was this: Agnetha had once been in love with the younger brother of the lord of the manor, a man named Thomas Gray. He was, they said, a second son with a fondness for astronomy and idle conversation, who had little interest in title or land. In their youth, he and Agnetha would meet at the edge of the courtyard, beneath the tree, to read aloud from books borrowed from the manor's dusty library. He was charming. She was clever. Together, they seemed perfectly ill-suited for the expectations of courtship. They made no announcement. There was no betrothal. But one summer, Thomas left for London to study with a physician or a philosopher, or perhaps just to be away. The details were never agreed upon. Letters may have been exchanged, or they may have not, but he never returned. Agnetha, still quite young, did not plead or protest. She simply began coming to the bench. At first, she stayed only for a short while, as if expecting someone to arrive late. Then for longer periods, until eventually she would spend the entire afternoon beneath the tree, working her needle through fabric with steady hands. It became, in time, a part of the manor's rhythm. Carriages passed. Seasons changed. New generations of staff came and went. But every Sunday, when the bell from the nearby chapel marked the hour past midday, would take her place on the bench and begin to sew. The things she made were never sold or displayed. Occasionally, she would leave behind a bundle of stitched linen depicting stars, birds, or cryptic plant patterns on the bench. The housekeeper, unsure what to do with them, began storing them in an unused wardrobe in the east wing. No one knew where she lived. She came on foot, always from the same narrow path between hedges. Her hair turned grey, her hands grew stiff, yet she continued to arrive, always dressed with simple dignity, never speaking unless spoken to, and never speaking of the man she once waited for. One summer, she failed to appear. The gardeners noticed first. The following Sunday, she did not come again, nor the next. After 4 weeks, the head maid opened the wardrobe in the east wing and found a new bundle had been a dada. Final embroidery wrapped in cloth. No one knew who had placed it there. The pattern was unlike the others. It showed a single mulberry tree, lopsided and detailed with care, stitched with a bench beneath it. On the bench, a figure sat with her back turned. In the corner of the cloth, embroidered in a delicate hand, were the words, "Not all waiting is for return. Some is for remembering." The bench remains. The tree still leans. New owners came and went, and though the manor changed hands several times, the staff always warned the groundskeepers, "Do not move the bench beneath the mulberry tree." No one quite remembered why. They just knew that it belonged there, and so it stayed. Even when the tree stopped bearing fruit. Even when no one came to sit on it again. In the heart of 13th century Burgundy, nestled between the crumbling cloisters of the Abbey of Saint Martin du Bois and a small village known for its linen production, a garden grew that was not on any map. This garden, hidden behind a thick wall of yew and hazel, belonged to the Benedictine monks, a place of prayer, herbal remedies, and silence. Its neat rows of hyssop and rue were tended with discipline, not delight. Yet, between the blackcurrant shrubs and clumps of feverfew, something stirred that defied every vow ever spoken behind those monastery walls. Brother Anselm had been cloistered for over 20 years, since the age of 15. His hands, once calloused by farm tools, had grown gentle from years of copying psalms and tincturing balm. He rarely spoke, save for prayers and the occasional murmured observation to the bees he tended near the old apple tree. His world was ordered. Dawn bells, matins, garden work, copying manuscripts, vespers, silence. But in the spring of 1273, while he was collecting valerian root near the edge of the monastic garden, he noticed someone watching. Beyond the hedge, just down the slope of the hill, stood a girl with flaxen hair tied back in a kerchief. no older than 17, holding a basket full of linen strips. She was humming, not a hymn, but a peasant tune with an old pagan lilt. When their eyes met, she did not blush or turn away. She simply nodded and continued down the path toward the riverbank. Her name was Lisette, daughter of a local weaver. She often came to the stream to rinse dyed linen, and when the water level dropped in late spring, she would wade further upstream, just within view of the monastery's back wall. Whether by intention or coincidence, her appearances grew more frequent. Anselm noticed her more often. He began taking longer routes to the apiary, passing near the hedge at the precise hour she washed cloth. He found excuses to inspect the river herbs or gather mint growing wild near the bend. They never spoke. Not once, in this silence, a forbidden language bloomed, glances, gestures, the offering of wildflowers left near the mossy stone by the water's edge. He would find them there, sprigs of forget-me-nots, sometimes rosemary, sometimes sweet violets, knotted into a ring. He never saw her place them, yet every few days they were waiting. Anselm began leaving small things in return. A dried honeycomb, a single early apple, a clean strip of linen infused with balm for chapped hands, wordless exchanges, hidden in plain sight. The garden changed for him. Where once he saw order and duty, he now saw life blooming stubbornly through rules. The fig tree twisted against its wall as if yearning for freedom. The marigolds turned their faces to the sun like supplicants. And in the stillness of the stone bench under the pear tree, he began to sit, longer than necessary, simply watching the clouds. But the monastery, like all human institutions, watched too. Brother Gerard, the infirmarian, noticed Anselm's prolonged absences from scriptorium duty. He noted the worn path forming in the grass near the hedge. A novice reported seeing a girl, not once, but 3 times. Word of worldly distractions travelled quickly through the cloisters. Anselm was summoned. The abbot, old and soft-voiced, asked no questions. He only reminded Anselm of his vows, poverty, chastity, obedience. The world beyond the wall was full of temptation, he said. Even a glance could be the opening to a great unravelling. Anselm, still silent, bowed his head. He was forbidden from tending the garden. His duties were reassigned. Candle-making in the cellar, scraping vellum in the scriptorium. The herbs grew wild that month. The bees were left to themselves. Lisette waited for many days. The wildflowers at the mossy stone began to wilt. She placed no more rings of violets. The basket she once carried now sat empty at her side as she lingered near the riverbank. And then, one afternoon, she did not come. Weeks passed. Anselm said nothing. But each night, he dreamed of fig trees twisting free of walls and violets blooming where none had been planted. Late in summer, as the pears fell too early from their branches, the abbot took ill. Brother Gerard, overwhelmed, was forced to ask Anselm to return to the garden to retrieve angelica and wormwood for tincture. The bees still remembered him. The garden, though unkempt, seemed to stretch toward him. On the stone near the stream, now choked with thistle and overgrowth, he found something unexpected. Not a flower, but a piece of linen, sun-bleached and embroidered. A stitch of red thread showed a single symbol, a bee. He never knew how she had learned to sew that mark. It wasn't one she would have known from town. It was the emblem he had carved once on his beekeeping box, something she could only have glimpsed. From afar, Anselm folded the cloth and tucked it into the sleeve of his robe. He said nothing, but from that day on, he asked to return to garden duty, and the abbot, too weary to object, allowed it. he never saw Lisette again, but the stone by the stream remained clean. Sometimes, in spring, a sprig of rosemary appeared there, and now old and bent, would sit by the pear tree and listen to the bees, who never stopped humming her song. The city of Toledo, once ruled by Visigoths, then Muslims, then Christians, lay sprawled across a sun-bleached hill, its tiled roofs huddled beneath a ring of crumbling battlements. By the 14th century, the city was a strange mosaic, a mingling of Latin monks, Arabic scholars, Jewish poets, and wandering clerks, all living within whispering distance of one another. Beneath the northern city wall, tucked behind a modest home of Moorish arches and rough red bricks, grew a garden that few ever noticed. It did not appear on city registries. It did not belong to any noble. Yet it was there, quiet, green, and always open to the sky. Its keeper was a scholar named Yusuf ibn Malik, a translator of ancient texts who had once served in the court of Cordoba, but had since retired to Toledo. His garden was not ornamental. It was cultivated with purpose. Along a narrow canal watered by a diverted stream grew beds of fennel and saffron, lemon balm and chicory, rue and lavender. Trellises of grapes sagged toward clay benches where Yusuf would sit for hours, pen in one hand, a scroll in the other, always searching for words that crossed languages as easily as he once had. He lived alone, save for a cat named Idris and the occasional apprentice sent from the cathedral school. Most stayed a few weeks, bored by his long lectures on Greek etymology and the properties of crushed anemone seeds. But one apprentice remained. Her name was Clara, a stonemason's daughter with blunt fingers and clever eyes. She had arrived at Yusuf's gate with ink-stained sleeves and a scrap of paper on which she had copied a verse of Galen in Latin, Hebrew, and a clumsy Spanish translation. She was not enrolled in any school. Girls, after all, were not. But she had learned letters from her brother's discarded textbooks, and now sought someone who could teach her more. Why, USUF, in his slow and methodical way, asked nothing. He simply pointed to the garden bench and handed her a stylus. Clara came. Every morning, at first, she only copied Arabic terms for herbs, Latin prayers of healing, old Greek names for clouds. But over time, Yusuf allowed her into the garden beds themselves, showing her how to distinguish tarragon from mugwort, how to mix rue and sage into salves, how to press dried pomegranate blossoms into a cure for nosebes. They spoke very little. Yusuf preferred quiet. Clara, out of both respect and caution, followed his example, but she began writing notes, not on paper, but scratched gently into the stones of the garden's edging. A phrase here, a question there. Why is lavender stronger at dawn? Or what does sympathy of the humours mean? Yusuf would notice the markings, sometimes a day or two later. He would rub his chin, then leave replies, bits of paper tucked into cracks in the wall, or notes chalked on the underside of the bench. It was a kind of conversation, slow and careful, bound not by speech but by signs. One morning, Clara scratched a new line into the soft mortar near the garden path. It read, "Is knowledge forbidden when it lives in a woman's mind?" The note remained untouched for 3 days. Then, on the 4th day, Yusuf arrived with a small book wrapped in goat leather. It was written in Arabic, an early medical text attributed to Zainab of Basra, a physician long forgotten in European libraries. He placed it on the bench. Clara said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly when she opened it. From that day, Yusuf no longer left notes. He spoke to her softly, slowly, in full sentences. They discussed not only herbs and cures, but ancient philosophy, the translation of metaphors, the structure of knowledge itself. He never once asked why she wished to learn. He simply taught. In the eyes of the city, this garden was no different than any other. But it was, in truth, an anomaly, a space where custom softened and knowledge grew in unexpected places. And yet, even quiet gardens attract wind. One afternoon, a canon from the cathedral passed by on a routine inspection of properties near the wall. He heard voices, one male, one female, coming from behind the high fig trees. Suspicion bloomed as quickly as gossip. A woman studying among herbs. A man teaching her old medical texts in secret. Soon after, a letter arrived, sealed with ecclesiastical wax. Yusuf was summoned for questioning. Clara, being not a student nor a recognized scholar, was not summoned at all. She vanished the next day, leaving behind only her stylus and the leather-bound book, carefully wrapped again and placed under the stone bench. Yusuf went before the inquisitors. He explained, with care, that the girl was a student of language, not alchemy or forbidden lore, that she studied medicine as a curiosity, not as a practitioner, that no sedition nor sorcery was ever spoken in his garden. He was spared punishment, barely, but he was told to take no more apprentices. His garden remained his, but he would keep it alone. Years passed, Yusuf aged, and the garden grew denser, wilder. The fig trees dropped their fruit unchecked. The fennel choked the chicory. Idris the cat died quietly one summer, but each spring someone left a small pouch on the garden wall. Inside, dried lavender, pressed flat between pages of paper, filled with ink and questions. Questions that Yusuf never answered out loud, but always read. The garden was no longer silent, not truly, for some kinds of speech live on in the act of tending, in the gift of books left wrapped in leather, and in gardens where minds once met, even when custom tried to keep them apart.